Welcome to Sinister Memory. If you're new here, subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story. Let's get to today's story. The autumn of 1879 found Clara Vane in the enviable position of being considered the most eligible young woman in Millbrook County, Massachusetts. At 22 years of age, she possessed the combination of beauty, refinement, and substantial inheritance that made her the subject of considerable attention from families seeking advantageous marriages for their sons. Her father, industrialist Harrison Vane, had built a fortune in textile manufacturing that provided Clara with both social standing and the kind of dowry that transformed casual suitors into determined pursuers. Clara's reputation throughout the county rested on qualities that contemporary society valued most highly in young women of her class. She demonstrated exceptional skill in the domestic arts, having mastered needlework, painting, and musical performance to degrees that impressed even the most critical observers. Her comportment in social situations reflected the careful education she had received from private tutors and finishing schools, displaying the kind of gracious demeanor that marked her as suitable for marriage into the most prominent families of New England society. The Vane family estate occupied a commanding position overlooking the Millbrook River, its Gothic Revival architecture serving as a testament to Harrison Vane's success in transforming his modest beginnings into substantial wealth. The house itself had become a gathering place for the county's social elite, with Clara serving as hostess for events that drew attendees from Boston and New York. Her ability to manage these complex social occasions demonstrated organizational skills that further enhanced her reputation as an ideal candidate for marriage. Clara's physical appearance contributed significantly to her desirability as a potential bride. Contemporary accounts describe her as possessing the kind of ethereal beauty that artists of the period sought to capture in their portraits of idealized femininity. Her auburn hair, when arranged according to the fashions of the day, created a striking contrast with her pale complexion and green eyes. More importantly for her social prospects, her appearance suggested the kind of delicate constitution that wealthy families associated with refined breeding and moral purity. The educational advantages that Harrison Vane had provided for his daughter extended beyond the typical accomplishments expected of young women in her social position. Clara had received instruction in literature, history, and natural philosophy that equipped her with conversational abilities rare among her contemporaries. Her knowledge of current events and cultural developments made her an engaging companion for the educated men who comprised her circle of potential suitors. Though she was careful to display her learning in ways that enhanced rather than threatened masculine authority. Clara's charitable activities throughout Millbrook County had established her reputation as a young woman of exceptional moral character. She organized relief efforts for families affected by industrial accidents, supervised the distribution of food and clothing to the poor, and taught Sunday school classes at the Episcopal Church, where her family maintained prominent membership. These activities demonstrated the kind of Christian devotion that parents sought in daughters-in-law, while also providing Clara with experience in leadership that would prove valuable in managing a household of her own. The social season of 1879 had brought Clara into contact with numerous young men whose families considered them suitable matches for a woman of her standing. Among these suitors, several had distinguished themselves through persistent courtship that suggested serious matrimonial intentions. The competition for Clara's attention had become a subject of considerable interest throughout the county, with observers speculating about which family would ultimately succeed in securing an engagement that would unite two substantial fortunes. Harrison Vane's approach to his daughter's marriage prospects reflected both paternal affection and shrewd business instincts. He had made it clear that Clara would be permitted to exercise considerable influence over the selection of her husband. though he reserved the right to approve any final arrangements. This balance between personal choice and parental authority positioned Clara in the unusual situation of having genuine agency in determining her future while still operating within the constraints that governed marriages among the wealthy. The Vane family's position in Massachusetts society provided Clara with access to cultural and intellectual opportunities that distinguished her from many of her contemporaries. Regular trips to Boston exposed her to theater, lectures, and social gatherings that broadened her perspective beyond the provincial concerns of Millbrook County. These experiences contributed to a sophistication that made her particularly attractive to suitors who valued intelligence and cultural awareness in addition to beauty and wealth. Clara's daily routine during the autumn of 1879 reflected the careful balance between personal development and social obligations that characterized the lives of young women in her position. Her mornings were devoted to correspondence, household management, and the supervision of charitable projects. Afternoons brought social calls, cultural activities, and the kind of public appearances that maintained her visibility within county society. Evenings were reserved for family gatherings, formal dinners, and the entertainment of guests whose presence reinforced the Vane family's social prominence. The winter months of 1879 brought significant developments in Clara Vane's matrimonial prospects, culminating in an arrangement that satisfied both romantic inclination and practical considerations. The successful suitor emerged from among the persistent admirers who had competed for her attention throughout the social season, representing a family whose wealth and social standing complemented the Vane family's position in Massachusetts society. The engagement announcement, published in newspapers throughout New England, generated considerable interest among readers who had followed the courtship with the attention typically reserved for matters of public importance. Frederick Ashworth had distinguished himself among Clara's suitors through a combination of personal qualities and family advantages that made him an exceptionally suitable match. The Ashworth family's fortune, derived from shipping and banking enterprises, provided financial security that would allow Clara to maintain the lifestyle to which she had become accustomed. More importantly, Frederick's education at Harvard and subsequent involvement in his family's business interests demonstrated the kind of intellectual capacity and professional competence that Clara found attractive in a potential husband. The courtship between Clara and Frederick had proceeded according to the elaborate rituals that governed romantic relationships among the wealthy during this period. Their interactions took place under careful supervision, with chaperoned visits, formal dinners, and public appearances providing opportunities for the development of mutual affection within socially acceptable boundaries. Clara's correspondence from this period, preserved in family archives, reveals genuine enthusiasm for Frederick's company and optimism about their future together. Harrison Vane's approval of the match reflected both personal satisfaction with Frederick's character and strategic appreciation for the business opportunities that would result from uniting the Vane and Ashworth families. The textile manufacturing interests that had built the Vane fortune could benefit significantly from access to the Ashworth shipping network, while the banking connections would provide capital for expansion into new markets. The marriage represented the kind of alliance that strengthened both families' positions in the competitive world of New England commerce. The engagement period provided Clara with opportunities to demonstrate the domestic skills that would be essential to her success as Frederick's wife. She supervised the planning of elaborate dinner parties that showcased her ability to manage complex social events, organized charitable functions that highlighted her commitment to community service, and participated in cultural activities that reinforced her reputation as an accomplished young woman. These activities served as informal auditions for the role of society hostess that she would assume after marriage. Frederick's family welcomed Clara with enthusiasm that reflected both genuine affection and recognition of the advantages she would bring to their social position. The Ashworth matriarch, a formidable woman whose approval was considered essential for any potential daughter-in-law, pronounced Clara to be exactly the kind of refined and capable young woman who would enhance the family's reputation. This endorsement removed any remaining obstacles to the marriage and allowed wedding preparations to proceed with confidence. The selection of St. Michael's Episcopal Chapel for the wedding ceremony reflected both families' desire to create an event that would be remembered as one of the most significant social occasions in Millbrook County's history. The Gothic revival structure, completed only 5 years earlier, provided an appropriately impressive setting for a marriage that would unite two of the region's most prominent families. The chapel's capacity for accommodating large gatherings made it ideal for the extensive guest list that both families considered necessary for an event of this importance. Wedding preparations during the spring of 1880 consumed Clara's attention and provided her with opportunities to exercise the organizational abilities that had impressed observers throughout her engagement. She supervised the selection of flowers, the design of decorations, and the coordination of musical performances that would transform the chapel into a setting worthy of the occasion. Her attention to detail and ability to manage multiple complex arrangements simultaneously demonstrated capabilities that extended far beyond the typical domestic accomplishments expected of young women in her position. The guest list for the wedding reflected the social prominence of both families and their desire to use the occasion as an opportunity to strengthen relationships with other influential members of New England society. Invitations were extended to relatives, business associates, political figures, and social leaders whose presence would confirm the importance of the union and provide networking opportunities that could benefit both families in future endeavors. The anticipated attendance of over 200 guests required careful planning to ensure that the event would proceed smoothly despite its complexity. Clara's trousseau, assembled during the months preceding the wedding, represented both personal taste and social expectations regarding the wardrobe appropriate for a young woman entering marriage at her social level. The collection included garments suitable for every conceivable social occasion, from intimate family gatherings to formal public events, demonstrating the kind of preparation that wealthy families considered essential for their daughters. Success in married life. The spring of 1880 brought subtle changes in Clara Vane's behavior that initially escaped the notice of those closest to her, manifesting as minor alterations in routines that had remained consistent throughout her engagement period. Her family attributed these shifts to the natural nervousness that afflicted many brides as their wedding dates approached, viewing her occasional moments of distraction and unusual quietness as temporary responses to the pressures of organizing such an elaborate social event. The servants at the Vane estate, however, began to observe patterns that suggested something more significant than typical pre-wedding anxiety. Clara's sleep patterns underwent the most noticeable transformation during these weeks, with household staff reporting that lights remained burning in her chambers well into the early morning hours. Her personal maid discovered evidence of extensive nighttime activities that included the rearrangement of furniture, the creation of detailed sketches depicting architectural layouts, and the composition of lengthy written passages that Clara kept carefully hidden from family members. These nocturnal pursuits appeared to consume increasing amounts of her energy, leaving her visibly fatigued during daytime social obligations. The content of Clara's correspondence during this period revealed preoccupations that extended beyond typical wedding planning concerns. Letters to distant relatives contained unusually specific inquiries about their travel arrangements, with particular attention to arrival times and seating preferences for the ceremony. Her communications with local merchants involved detailed discussions of delivery schedules and storage requirements that seemed excessive for the quantities of goods being ordered. Most significantly, her exchanges with church officials included questions about the chapel's architectural features and safety procedures that struck recipients as oddly thorough for a bride's typical concerns. Clara's charitable activities, which had previously provided her with genuine satisfaction and social recognition, began to take on characteristics that puzzled both beneficiaries and fellow volunteers. Her visits to impoverished families focused increasingly on gathering information about their living conditions, employment situations, and family relationships rather than providing the assistance that had motivated her earlier efforts. She demonstrated particular interest in families with large numbers of children, asking detailed questions about their daily routines and gathering schedules that seemed unrelated to charitable purposes. The Vane family's social calendar during this period included numerous pre-wedding events that provided opportunities for observers to note changes in Clara's demeanor and conversational patterns. Her interactions with wedding guests revealed an intensity of focus that made some attendees uncomfortable, particularly when discussions turned to topics related to family histories and personal relationships. She displayed an unusual ability to remember minute details about people's lives and circumstances, often referencing information that surprised those who had shared it with her weeks or months earlier. Frederick Ashworth's visits to the Vane estate during the final weeks before the wedding provided him with opportunities to observe his fiancée's evolving behavior, though his interpretations of these changes reflected the optimistic perspective of a man deeply in love. He attributed Clara's occasional moments of distraction to the natural excitement of a bride anticipating her wedding day, viewing her increased attention to detail as evidence of her commitment to creating a memorable celebration. His letters to family members during this period express satisfaction with Clara's dedication to wedding preparations and confidence in their future happiness together. The domestic staff at the Vane estate began to notice Clara's growing interest in the practical aspects of household management that extended beyond her previous supervisory role. She requested detailed explanations of heating systems, ventilation arrangements, and the storage of various household supplies, particularly those related to lighting and maintenance. Her questions about fire safety procedures and emergency protocols struck servants as unusually thorough, though they attributed her concerns to the natural anxiety of a young woman preparing to manage her own household. Clara's religious observances during this period underwent subtle modifications that reflected changing priorities and preoccupations. Her attendance at church services remained consistent, but her behavior during worship suggested a mind occupied with matters unrelated to spiritual devotion. She spent considerable time studying the architectural features of St. Michael's Chapel during these visits, paying particular attention to structural elements and spatial arrangements that most parishioners ignored. Her conversations with church officials increasingly focused on practical matters related to the building's operation rather than theological or spiritual concerns. The final weeks before the wedding brought an acceleration in Clara's unusual activities, with family members noting her increased energy and apparent excitement about the approaching ceremony. Her enthusiasm for wedding preparations seemed to intensify rather than diminish as the date approached, contrasting with the typical pattern of bride's anxiety that often peaked in the days immediately before marriage. This sustained high level of engagement with wedding planning struck some observers as remarkable, though none suspected the true nature of Clara's preparations. The month preceding Clara Vane's wedding witnessed a series of clandestine activities that would later be recognized as methodical preparations for an event far different from the celebration that family and friends anticipated. Clara's ability to maintain her public facade of bridal excitement while simultaneously orchestrating these secret arrangements demonstrated a level of deception and planning that shocked those who thought they knew her character intimately. The discovery of her true intentions would come only after the devastating consequences of her actions had already unfolded. Clara's nocturnal expeditions to St. Michael's Chapel began during the third week of May, utilizing a duplicate key that she had obtained through careful manipulation of the church sexton's daily routines. These midnight visits allowed her to conduct detailed examinations of the building's interior without the scrutiny that would have accompanied daytime inspections. She mapped the chapel's layout with architectural precision, noting the locations of support beams, ventilation systems, and the positioning of pews that would determine seating arrangements for wedding guests. The acquisition of materials for Clara's secret project required careful coordination with suppliers who had no reason to suspect the true purpose of her purchases. She arranged for the delivery of lamp oil, candles, and various combustible substances under the pretense of enhancing the chapel's lighting for the wedding ceremony. Her orders specified quantities that far exceeded normal requirements for such events, but her reputation for perfectionism in wedding preparations provided adequate explanation for what might otherwise have seemed excessive requests. Clara's study of fire behavior and building construction occupied considerable time during her sleepless nights, with evidence later discovered indicating that she had consulted technical manuals and architectural drawings to understand how flames would spread through the chapel's wooden interior. Her research extended to the properties of different materials and their rates of combustion, suggesting a scientific approach to planning that contradicted the impulsive nature that investigators would initially attribute to her actions. The positioning of accelerants throughout St. Michael's Chapel required multiple visits and careful attention to concealment techniques that would prevent discovery during routine maintenance activities. Clara's familiarity with the building's cleaning schedule allowed her to place materials in locations where they would remain undisturbed until the wedding ceremony. She demonstrated particular attention to areas beneath pews and behind decorative elements, where combustible substances could be hidden from casual observation while remaining accessible for ignition. Clara's manipulation of wedding seating arrangements served purposes that extended beyond the social considerations that typically governed such decisions. Her insistence on specific positioning for family members and close friends reflected careful calculation of escape routes and proximity to exits, rather than the relationship dynamics that usually influence these choices. She paid particular attention to ensuring that elderly relatives and those with mobility limitations would be seated in areas where evacuation would prove most difficult. The selection of wedding attire underwent modifications during the final weeks that reflected Clara's awareness of the conditions she would face during the ceremony. Her choice of fabrics and accessories prioritized fire resistance over traditional bridal aesthetics, though these practical considerations were disguised as personal preferences that aroused no suspicion among family members or seamstresses. She also arranged for the storage of additional clothing at the chapel, ostensibly for photographs, but actually to facilitate her escape after implementing her plan. Clara's correspondence during this period included coded communications with individuals whose identities remained unknown to investigators who later examined her papers. These letters, written in a cipher that defied contemporary cryptographic analysis, suggested coordination with accomplices or advisors who provided guidance for her preparations. The existence of this correspondence indicated that Clara's actions were not the result of sudden mental breakdown, but rather the culmination of extended planning involving external consultation. The rehearsal dinner, held 3 days before the wedding, provided Clara with a final opportunity to observe her intended victims and confirm the effectiveness of her preparations. Her behavior during this event struck several attendees as unusually intense, with a focus on memorizing details about guests, appearances, and mannerisms that seemed excessive even for a bride's natural excitement. She paid particular attention to family members who had traveled considerable distances to attend the wedding, as if cataloguing those whose absence would be most deeply felt. Clara's final preparations included the creation of detailed written instructions that were discovered only after the tragedy, outlining precise timing for the ignition sequence and contingency plans for various scenarios that might arise during the ceremony. These documents revealed a level of premeditation that contradicted initial theories about temporary insanity or emotional breakdown, forcing investigators to confront the possibility that Clara had planned mass murder with the same methodical attention to detail that characterized her approach to social events. The eve of the wedding found Clara in a state of apparent calm that impressed family members who had expected to find her overcome with nervous excitement. Her serene demeanor and confident manner suggested complete readiness for the ceremony, though the true nature of her preparations remained hidden from those who wished her well on what they believed would be the happiest day of her life. The morning of June 15th, 1880, dawned with the kind of perfect weather that seemed to bless Clara Vane's wedding day with divine approval. Clear skies and gentle breezes created ideal conditions for the elaborate ceremony that had consumed months of planning and generated anticipation throughout Millbrook County. The Vane estate bustled with activity as servants made final preparations for the reception that would follow the chapel ceremony, while Clara herself maintained a composure that impressed everyone who encountered her during these crucial hours. Clara's morning routine proceeded with mechanical precision that contrasted sharply with the emotional turbulence typically associated with wedding days. She submitted to the ministrations of her personal maid and the visiting hairdresser with patient cooperation, offering suggestions about her appearance that demonstrated careful consideration of practical requirements rather than vanity. Her selection of jewelry and accessories reflected choices made weeks earlier, eliminating the last-minute decisions that often characterized bridal preparations. The arrival of wedding guests at St. Michael's Chapel began in the early afternoon, with carriages delivering family members and friends who had traveled considerable distances to witness the union of two prominent families. Clara observed these arrivals from her dressing room window at the Vane estate, noting the punctuality of various relatives and the seating arrangements that would place them in predetermined positions throughout the chapel. Her attention to these details suggested nervous excitement to observers who had no reason to suspect more sinister motivations. Frederick Ashworth's preparation for the ceremony took place at his family's estate, where he received the congratulations of male relatives and business associates who viewed the marriage as beneficial for both personal and professional reasons. His correspondence from this morning, discovered among his papers after the tragedy, expressed genuine happiness about his impending marriage and optimism about the future he would share with Clara. These sentiments would later serve as painful reminders of the deception that had characterized their entire relationship. The bridal party's assembly at the Vane estate provided Clara with opportunities to interact with the young women who would accompany her to the chapel, including cousins and friends whose presence added to the ceremony's social significance. Her behavior toward these attendants displayed the gracious warmth that had always characterized her social interactions, giving no indication of the catastrophe she intended to orchestrate within hours. Their later testimonies would emphasize the complete absence of warning signs that might have suggested Clara's true intentions. Clara's final inspection of St. Michael's Chapel, conducted under the pretense of ensuring that decorative arrangements met her specifications, allowed her to verify that her hidden preparations remained undiscovered and properly positioned. She moved through the building with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with every architectural detail, checking locations where accelerants had been concealed while maintaining the appearance of a bride concerned with aesthetic perfection. Her satisfaction with these arrangements was carefully disguised as pleasure with the chapel's festive appearance. The procession from the Vane estate to St. Michael's Chapel began precisely at the appointed hour, with Clara travelling in an elaborately decorated carriage that had been specially prepared for the occasion. Her father's pride in her appearance and behaviour during this journey was evident to all observers, as Harrison Vane had every reason to believe that his daughter's marriage would represent the culmination of years of careful preparation for her entry into society's highest ranks. The chapel's interior presented a magnificent spectacle that justified the months of planning that had preceded this day. Floral arrangements, musical preparations, and seating configurations created an atmosphere of celebration that impressed even the most sophisticated guests. The presence of prominent families from throughout New England confirmed the social significance of the event and provided Clara with the audience she required for the demonstration she had planned. Clara's arrival at the chapel marked the beginning of the final phase of preparations that had consumed her thoughts and energy for months. Her composed demeanor as she prepared to enter the building gave no indication of the transformation that would soon shock everyone present. The bride who stepped from her carriage appeared to be exactly what society expected: a beautiful young woman ready to begin the next chapter of a privileged life. The interior of St. Michael's Chapel had been transformed into a vision of Victorian elegance that exceeded even the most optimistic expectations of the assembled guests. 237 attendees filled the wooden pews, their finest attire creating a tapestry of silk, velvet, and jewels that reflected the social prominence of both the Vane and Ashworth families. The Gothic Revival architecture provided a dramatic backdrop for the ceremony, with afternoon sunlight streaming through stained glass windows to cast colourful patterns across the congregation gathered to witness what they believed would be a joyous union. Clara's entrance into the chapel marked the culmination of months of anticipation, as guests rose to observe the bride who had captured the attention of Massachusetts society throughout her engagement period. Her wedding gown, crafted from ivory silk with intricate beadwork that had required weeks of skilled labor, created an impression of ethereal beauty that drew admiring glances from every corner of the chapel. The train of her dress, extending nearly 6 feet behind her, required careful management as she proceeded down the aisle toward the altar, where Frederick waited with visible emotion. The processional music, performed by a quartet of musicians specially engaged for the occasion, provided an appropriately solemn accompaniment to Clara's measured progress toward the front of the chapel. Her pace remained steady and controlled, giving no indication of the nervous excitement that typically affected brides during this crucial moment. Observers later recalled the unusual composure she displayed, interpreting it as evidence of her natural grace under pressure rather than recognizing it as the calm determination of someone implementing a carefully orchestrated plan. Frederick Ashworth's position at the altar provided him with the best view of his approaching bride, and his expression reflected the genuine happiness of a man who believed himself fortunate to have won Clara's affection. His family members, seated in the front pews, shared his obvious satisfaction with the match that would unite two of New England's most successful commercial dynasties. The Ashworth matriarch, whose approval had been essential for the engagement, nodded with satisfaction as she observed Clara's dignified approach to the altar. The Reverend Dr. Jonathan Pemberton, who had officiated at numerous society weddings throughout his distinguished career, began the ceremony with the traditional words that had sanctified countless marriages in this same chapel. His resonant voice carried clearly throughout the building, reaching even those guests seated in the rear pews who had arrived too late to secure more advantageous positions. The familiar liturgy created an atmosphere of reverence that masked the growing tension that only Clara herself could feel as the moment for action approached. Clara's responses during the early portions of the ceremony demonstrated the perfect elocution and composure that her education had instilled, giving no indication of the thoughts that occupied her mind as she stood before the altar. Her voice remained steady and clear as she participated in the ritual exchanges that would normally bind her to Frederick in matrimony. The congregation listened with the respectful attention that such occasions demanded, unaware that they were witnessing the final moments before an unprecedented act of violence. The positioning of family members throughout the chapel reflected Clara's careful manipulation of seating arrangements during the preceding weeks. Her elderly relatives occupied pews near the center of the building, where their mobility limitations would prove most disadvantageous when escape became necessary. The Ashworth family's prominent placement in the front rows ensured their proximity to the altar where Clara stood, making them particularly vulnerable to the conflagration she had planned. Children from both families had been seated with their parents in locations that would maximize the tragedy's impact on future generations. The chapel's architectural features, which had impressed guests as they entered the building, would soon reveal their significance in Clara's calculations. The wooden construction and limited exits that characterized Gothic Revival church design created conditions that would facilitate the rapid spread of fire while hampering evacuation efforts. The high ceilings and decorative elements that added to the building's aesthetic appeal would channel flames and smoke in patterns that Clara had studied during her nocturnal visits to the structure. The moment of transition from ceremony to catastrophe approached as Clara maintained her position at the altar. Her outward attention focused on the religious proceedings while her mind calculated the precise timing required for maximum effect. The congregation remained completely unaware of the danger that surrounded them, their attention absorbed by the traditional ritual that had brought them together in celebration. The contrast between their expectations and the reality that Clara was about to unleash would create a psychological trauma that would haunt survivors for the remainder of their lives. The final moments of normalcy passed with agonizing slowness for Clara, whose preparation and planning had brought her to this crucial juncture where months of secret activity would culminate in an act of unprecedented destruction. The transformation from sacred ceremony to infernal nightmare began with a movement so subtle that most guests initially failed to recognize its significance. Clara's hand, which had been resting gracefully at her side throughout the early portions of the wedding service, moved with practiced precision toward the small incendiary device concealed within the folds of her wedding gown. The mechanism, no larger than a pocket watch, had been crafted according to specifications that Clara had developed during her months of secret preparation, designed to initiate a chain reaction that would engulf the entire chapel within minutes. The first flames appeared near the altar with an intensity that immediately distinguished them from any accidental fire that might have resulted from candles or oil lamps. The accelerants that Clara had positioned throughout the chapel during her nocturnal visits ignited in rapid succession, creating multiple points of combustion that eliminated any possibility of containing the blaze through conventional firefighting methods. The chemical composition of these materials produced flames that burned with unusual ferocity, generating heat and smoke that quickly overwhelmed the chapel's limited ventilation systems. Frederick Ashworth's initial reaction to the sudden appearance of fire reflected the confusion that gripped most of the wedding guests during these crucial first moments. His instinctive movement toward Clara, motivated by concern for her safety, brought him directly into the path of flames that had already begun to spread across the altar area. The realization that his bride had orchestrated this catastrophe would come only in his final moments, as the fire consumed the wooden structure around them with terrifying speed. The congregation's response to the rapidly spreading flames revealed the effectiveness of Clara's manipulation of seating arrangements and her understanding of human behavior under extreme stress. The elderly relatives whom she had positioned in the chapel center found themselves trapped by younger guests who pushed toward the limited exits in panic-driven attempts to escape the building. The narrow aisles and closely spaced pews that had created an intimate atmosphere for the ceremony now served as obstacles that prevented orderly evacuation. Clara's own movements during these chaotic moments demonstrated the careful planning that had preceded this day, as she navigated through the spreading flames with knowledge of safe passages that she had identified during her secret inspections of the building. Her wedding gown, despite its elaborate construction, had been modified with fire-resistant materials that provided temporary protection as she moved toward an exit that remained unknown to the trapped guests. Her escape route had been rehearsed during multiple nocturnal visits to ensure that she could reach safety while the building burned around her. The chapel's wooden construction proved ideal for Clara's purposes, as the flames spread through the structure with a speed that exceeded even her most optimistic calculations. The Gothic revival architecture that had impressed wedding guests now revealed its vulnerability to fire, with decorative elements and support beams feeding the conflagration that transformed the sacred space into a death trap. The building's age and the dry conditions of the early summer season created perfect circumstances for the rapid consumption of everything combustible within the structure. The screams and desperate movements of trapped guests created a cacophony that could be heard throughout Millbrook County, alerting residents to the disaster unfolding at St. Michael's Chapel. However, the remote location of the building and the limited firefighting capabilities available in 1880 meant that outside assistance would arrive too late to save those caught within the burning structure. Clara's selection of this particular venue had taken into account the isolation that would prevent effective rescue efforts. The collapse of portions of the chapel's roof occurred within 15 minutes of the fire's ignition, trapping additional victims beneath burning timber and creating conditions that made survival impossible for anyone remaining inside the building. The intensity of the flames generated temperatures that caused rapid structural failure, while the smoke that filled the interior space created toxic conditions that overcame victims before the fire itself could reach them. Clara's emergence from the burning chapel presented her with the opportunity to observe the effectiveness of her planning while maintaining the appearance of a traumatized survivor. Her positioning outside the building allowed her to witness the final moments of the structure's destruction while appearing to be another victim of the tragedy rather than its architect. The burns and smoke damage she had sustained during her escape provided physical evidence that supported her claim to have barely survived the catastrophe. The final collapse of St. Michael's Chapel occurred as volunteer firefighters arrived from the town center, their efforts limited to preventing the spread of flames to surrounding vegetation rather than rescuing anyone trapped within the building. The complete destruction of the structure ensured that evidence of Clara's preparations would be consumed along with her victims, leaving investigators with limited physical proof of the premeditation that had made this massacre possible. The smoldering ruins of St. Michael's Chapel presented a scene of devastation that defied comprehension for the first responders who arrived in the aftermath of Clara's calculated massacre. The Gothic revival structure, which had stood as a symbol of faith and community for 5 years, had been reduced to charred timber and twisted metal within the span of 30 minutes. The intensity of the fire had been so extreme that identifying individual victims would prove impossible in many cases, leaving families to mourn loved ones whose remains could never be properly recovered or distinguished from the general carnage. Clara's performance as a traumatized survivor began immediately upon her escape from the burning chapel, as she positioned herself among the growing crowd of townspeople who had rushed to the scene upon seeing the smoke and hearing the screams. Her wedding gown, strategically damaged during her planned escape, provided visual evidence of her supposed ordeal, while the burns on her hands and arms offered physical proof that she had endured the same dangers as the genuine victims. Her apparent shock and inability to provide coherent accounts of the tragedy's cause convinced initial observers that she represented another casualty rather than the perpetrator. The identification of victims proceeded slowly and with considerable difficulty, as the extreme heat had rendered many bodies unrecognizable and destroyed personal effects that might have aided in the process. 36 individuals had perished in the conflagration, including Frederick Ashworth, whose charred remains were discovered near the altar where he had waited to begin his married life. The Ashworth family patriarch, 3 elderly Vane relatives, and numerous children from both families comprised a casualty list that devastated 2 of Massachusetts' most prominent social circles. Harrison Vane's arrival at the scene of his daughter's wedding transformed him from a proud father anticipating celebration into a grief-stricken man confronting incomprehensible loss. His immediate concern for Clara's welfare and his gratitude for her survival prevented him from questioning the circumstances that had allowed her to escape while so many others perished. The shock of losing multiple family members in a single catastrophic event overwhelmed his capacity for rational analysis during these crucial early hours. The initial investigation into the fire's cause focused on accidental explanations that seemed consistent with the evidence available to local authorities. The presence of numerous candles and oil lamps throughout the chapel provided plausible sources of ignition, while the building's wooden construction offered obvious fuel for rapid flame spread. Investigators lacked the expertise necessary to recognize signs of deliberate arson, particularly given the complete destruction of physical evidence that might have revealed Clara's preparations. Clara's medical treatment following the fire provided her with additional opportunities to reinforce her victim status while gathering information about the investigation's progress. The local physician who attended to her burns found nothing suspicious about her injuries, which appeared consistent with someone who had barely escaped a burning building. Her apparent emotional trauma and periodic episodes of hysteria convinced medical professionals that she required extended care and protection from additional stress. The community's response to the tragedy reflected the shock and grief that gripped Millbrook County as news of the disaster spread throughout New England. The loss of so many prominent citizens in a single event created a void in local society that would require years to fill, while the destruction of St. Michael's Chapel eliminated a focal point for religious and social activities. Memorial services held in other venues provided opportunities for collective mourning, though the absence of identifiable remains for many victims complicated traditional funeral rites. Clara's integration into the community of survivors and mourners required careful management of her public persona to maintain sympathy while avoiding scrutiny that might reveal inconsistencies in her account of events. Her participation in memorial services and charitable efforts to assist other survivors demonstrated the kind of resilience and community spirit that enhanced her reputation as someone who had overcome tremendous adversity. Her apparent dedication to honoring the memory of the victims provided cover for activities that actually served to monitor the investigation's progress. The insurance investigation that followed the fire's immediate aftermath introduced the first element of professional scrutiny that posed potential risks to Clara's deception. Insurance companies' financial interests in determining the fire's cause led to more thorough examination of the evidence than local authorities had conducted, though the complete destruction of the chapel limited the information available for analysis. Clara's status as a victim rather than a beneficiary of insurance claims helped deflect suspicion that might otherwise have focused on her unusual survival. The establishment of a relief fund for fire victims provided Clara with another opportunity to demonstrate her commitment to helping those affected by the tragedy, while positioning herself as someone who had suffered losses comparable to other survivors. Her contributions to this fund and her participation in its administration reinforced her image as a community-minded individual, whose primary concern involved supporting others rather than concealing her own culpability in their suffering. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.